Last time on, the knife. Toby had just told Lori that Miss Stine was not his mother. When she asked him who she really was, Toby said that he wasn't allowed to say, that she will get angry if he does. Miss Stine finally noticed Toby talking to Lori. She scolded him and called him back over to her. He reluctantly walked back over. She grabbed him by the hand and pulled him toward the elevator. Just before getting on, Toby looked at Lori with one last pleading look. Once they were gone, Lori walked up to Rick and asked him why he was on the children's floor. He told her that he had been sent there on an errand. She then asked him about Toby's mother. Rick confirmed that Miss Stine was his mother, and he told Lori that they had recently moved to Shadyside and lived on Fear Street. He said that he was telling Miss Stine where the nearest pharmacy was so she could pick up a prescription for Toby. Lori wondered how he could direct her to a pharmacy when he was new in Shadyside himself. Then, without arousing suspicion, Lori casually asked Rick why he was at the hospital so late when he called her the night before. Rick denied being at the hospital, then quickly changed the subject, asking her if she'd like to go out with him after they got off work today. She told him no, reminding herself that she couldn't trust him. Plus, she already had plans to meet up with Andy and Sky after work. Suddenly, the phone at the nurse's station rang out and interrupted their conversation. Lori went to pick it up, but hesitated when she saw a box of surgical knives on the desk beside the phone. The phone continued to ring as Rick finally reached and answered it. Lori then went back into Toby's room to get her bag and tunic. When she came back, Rick had just finished writing a note that he had left at the nurse's station. Then she watched as Rick picked up the box of surgical knives and stuck them into his pocket. Lori was now convinced that Rick was a liar and a thief. Just after Rick had left, the door to the Franklin Fear Wing came open and a group of construction workers bustled out of the new wing. During the commotion, Lori hadn't noticed that Nurse Gerard had returned to the nurse's station. She decided to ask if she had seen the knives on the desk, but Nurse Gerard only interrupted her and asked her to run an errand for her. Throughout the day, Lori kept thinking about Toby, and the more she thought about him, the more she realized that he was in trouble. When it was time for the nurse's shift change and all the workmen from the Fear Wing were leaving, Lori took advantage of the confusion and slipped into the office where the patients' records were stored. Only doctors and nurses were allowed in the office. She dug through the folders until she found the name Dean. Rick was right. Toby did live on Fear Street. She made a note of Toby's address and thought up an excuse to go visit him. She would go there on the pretext of selling Miss Dean a raffle ticket for the Mercedes-Benz that was being given away at the hospital. But Lori didn't want to go to Fear Street alone. She decided that she could ask Andy, Sky, or Jim Farrow if one of them would go with her. As she was about to leave the office, she noticed Nurse Wilton sitting at the nurse's station. She waited for a chance to leave. Eventually, Nurse Wilton dropped some papers to the floor. As she bent down to pick them up, Lori hurried out of the office, past the nurse's station and down the hall. But she wasn't fast enough. Nurse Wilton called out to her. Lori didn't answer and kept walking as fast as she could. She hurried to a service elevator that was only used to transport equipment and patients on gurneys. Lori frantically pushed the elevator button. She looked back to see Nurse Wilton coming after her. Finally, the doors came open and she rushed inside just in time. As the elevator began to move, Lori turned around to see an orderly with a patient on a gurney. The man told Lori that she wasn't allowed to be in the service elevator and told her that she was getting off on the next floor. When the elevator stopped, Lori immediately got off, even though she didn't know where she was. She noticed the sign that said, "Restricted floor, authorized personnel only." The whole floor was dark and deserted. She looked back at the elevator indicator and saw that it had returned to the 9th floor. Nurse Wilton must have seen where she got off at. Lori decided to make her way down the hall, checking every door along the way. She finally found an open room at the end of the hall, but when she entered, a strange smell stung her nostrils. She began to make out metal tables in the room. Lori gradually made her way further into the room, eventually slipping on something wet. She reached for the table to catch her balance, but she grabbed a hold of something cold and wet. It was the body of a corpse. In a panic, she realized where she was. She was in the anatomy lab. She began to notice more body parts laid out across the tables. She turned and frantically ran out of the room. When she got back down the hall and around the corner, she saw Nurse Wilton and an older man standing by the service elevator door. Lori stayed back and hid around the corner. As she watched, she realized that she recognized the man. It was Dr. Raymond Price, Andy's father. Lori sat back and watched as they entered the elevator and left. Then she took off to find the passenger elevators. She didn't relax until she was finally out of the hospital and safe behind the wheel of her car. Later that evening, Lori met up with Andy, Sky, and Jim Farrow at Patsy's Pizzeria. She told them about what had happened to her at the hospital. Sky asked her how she ended up on the anatomy floor, but Lori was reluctant to tell them the whole truth. She just lied and said she got off on the wrong floor. Lori decided to change the subject and asked them if anyone wanted to go with her to Fear Street. She told them about Toby and that she wanted to check on him, using the raffle tickets as an excuse. Sky spoke up for everyone and said that they could all go together. When they were done eating, they all piled into Andy's car and headed toward Fear Street. Using the address that Lori wrote down, they pulled up to a house that they believed to be the right one, but they couldn't find a number on the house to be sure. Lori split the tickets up and gave some to Andy and Jim, while her and Sky took the remaining tickets. They decided to split up and try a few different houses. Lori and Sky walked up to the first house and rang the doorbell. To their surprise, Miss Dean answered the door. They had the right house. Lori began her appeal and tried to sell some raffle tickets. Luckily for her, Miss Dean didn't seem to recognize her. When Lori was done talking, Miss Dean agreed to buy a ticket, but she seemed very irritated, and only bought a ticket to hurry up and get rid of Lori and Sky. Lori began to follow her into the house, but Miss Dean quickly turned around and snapped at her, telling her to remain outside until she got back with the money. As they stood there waiting, Lori began to hear a faint sound coming from deep within the Dean house. It was the sound of a child crying. Lori couldn't stand it any longer. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house looked minimal and run down. She peeked into the kitchen and saw a mess of dirty dishes. Then a noise startled Lori and caught her attention. She turned around to see Toby standing at the foot of the hallway stairs. She noticed that the boy looked awful, paler, and slightly skinnier than when he had left the hospital that morning. She wondered what could have happened to him in such a few short hours. As Lori walked towards Toby, he took a fearful step away from her. Suddenly, Miss Dean came rushing into the room. She yelled at Toby and gave him a push, telling him to get back upstairs and into his room. Then Miss Dean turned her anger on Lori. She told her that she had a lot of nerve coming into her home. Then she threw her money at Lori and told her to get out of her house. Lori rushed out of the home, fumbling the raffle tickets in her hand. On the way back home, Lori's thoughts were racing through her mind. Why did Toby seem so afraid of her? And more importantly, why didn't he remember her? Chapter 11. The following morning, Lori was hurrying past the information desk in the hospital lobby when the receptionist called out to her. "There's a note for you here, Lori," she said, holding out a small envelope. "Please see me as soon as you get in," the note read. It was written on the stationery of Doris Schneider, RN, supervisor of nurses at Shadyside Hospital, with a signature at the bottom. Lori imagined the worst all the way up in the elevator to the 8th floor office of Nurse Schneider, and she wasn't far from wrong. Nurse Schneider welcomed her with a kindly smile, but she was all business once Lori had taken a seat across from her. "I'm transferring you off the children's floor, Lori," the supervisor said. "You'll start this morning on 11 in the X-ray department. I know it's not as interesting as working on a patient floor, but, well, I've had some serious complaints about you." Lori opened her mouth to speak, but Nurse Schneider silenced her with a firm wave of her hand. "It seems that you haven't been helping enough, and that you've been rude. Apparently you've been bothering the patients and spying on the nurses. You were even caught going through confidential patient records, so I've been told." "Please, let me explain," Lori begged. "Nurse Wilton must have complained about me, but there's a reason." "I understand, dear," Nurse Schneider interrupted her. "The reports on your first weeks here at Shadyside are excellent. Everyone had fine things to say about you. That's why I'm transferring you, instead of asking you to leave the hospital." She glanced down at a paper on her desk. "I'm afraid you have upset one of my nurses. Yes, it was Nurse Wilton, and I can't permit that to continue. Edith Wilton is a superb nurse, and too valuable to me to ignore her request. She wants you off her floor, and I'll have to accommodate her." "I wasn't spying on her," Lori protested. "I was just worried about one of the little kids there, and I—" "Try not to take this personally, Lori. Our nurses are all overworked, and when they get tense, they will snap and complain. Heaven knows, I have to listen to them all the time. You simply got in the way of one of them. I'm going to get you out of her way so there won't be any further trouble." There wasn't any further discussion either. As sympathetic as Nurse Schneider was, she had made up her mind to transfer Lori, and that was the end of that. Lori was crushed when she left the supervisor's office. Still, it could have been worse. She could have been sent home permanently. It was small comfort, but anything was better than the humiliation of being told to leave. Lori spent a dreary morning on the 11th floor, filing giant envelopes of x-rays or pulling them out of oversized drawers as doctors called for them. The hours dragged, and Lori's gloom and despair mounted. She felt that the rest of her summer at Shadyside Hospital was going to be an endless tedium of dragging around heavy gray X-ray envelopes. Boring, just as Aunt Hillary had warned her. All morning she felt defeated, but by lunchtime she had snapped out of it. She was going to try to change things. She had a plan. In the cafeteria, she was excited as she explained to Sky what she was going to do. "Oh wow, you've got guts," Sky said over the noise of the lunch crowd. "It's the only way," Lori said. "If I talk to Nurse Wilton, if I apologize and tell her that I was only concerned about Toby, that I'm afraid he's being mistreated by his mother, she'll listen. She's a nurse after all." "She's a witch," Sky said. "If I were you, I'd stay away from her. She doesn't like you, period." "It's not fair. Maybe I shouldn't have been looking at the patient's records, but I wasn't doing any of those other things she accused me of. I'll say that I'm sorry and ask her to give me another chance on the children's floor. I'll say anything. I can't spend the rest of my summer in X-ray. I'll turn as gray as the envelopes there." "Why don't you wait a couple days? Let her calm down a little. If she's angry, you're not going to get anywhere with her." "No, I can't wait. It'll just get worse. I want to straighten this out as soon as I can. Today," Lori said passionately. "I'm going to see her right after work." "Well, good luck," Sky said without much enthusiasm. "I'll wait for you on the 9th floor, so I can tell you I told you so." Bucking the swarm of workmen leaving the Franklin Fear Wing for the day, Lori made her way to the nurse's station on the children's floor. Nurse Jenny Gerard was at the desk, looking frazzled. She had the phone receiver balanced between her ear and shoulder as she wrote a note with one hand, flipped through files with the other, and tried to fend off a good-looking construction worker who was hanging out flirting with her. When she hung up, she glared first at Lori, then at the workman. He got the hint. "Okay, babe. See you tomorrow," he said cheerfully, and left with the last of the construction crew for the service elevator. Nurse Gerard turned back to Lori in the calm that had followed the workman's departure. "Now, what do you want?" I was looking for Nurse Wilton. Have you seen her?" Lori asked. "She's around somewhere." The nurse answered in a tone that definitely meant, "Don't bother me." She jumped to her feet, picked a tray of medications off the utility table in the corner, and left the desk. Lori wasn't sure what to do next. As she stood there, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other, a door halfway down the hall opened. Nurse Wilton came out and strode briskly down the corridor in the opposite direction from the nurse's station. Now was her chance. Lori followed the nurse. She was about to call out, but stopped herself. Nurse Wilton was doing something strange. She had opened the door to the Fear Wing and was peering inside. Then, without a backward glance, she quickly stepped inside. The door swung closed behind her. Lori was totally puzzled. What reason would Nurse Wilton have to go into the new wing? And what should Lori do now? She decided to wait until the nurse came out, and then try to talk to her. She returned to the nurse's station, picked up the phone, and punched in her home number. After 5 rings, the answering machine came on. Keeping an eye on the Fear Wing door, Lori left a message for her aunt that she'd be late for dinner. As she was talking, she saw someone else go around the corner of the hall at the far end. Someone else who stopped outside the Fear Wing and quickly slipped inside. It was Rick Spencer, but he hadn't noticed Lori watching him. How weird, Lori thought, hanging up the phone. Why would both of them go in there? Was it a planned meeting, or was Rick following the nurse? Now what? Lori didn't take her eyes off the door, afraid that she'd miss Nurse Wilton when she came out. If she left now, she didn't know if she'd have the nerve to try to appeal to her the next day, and the thought of spending another day shut up in the X-ray department was too depressing to bear. However long it took, Lori decided to wait until she got her chance to talk to the old witch. 10 minutes stretched into 15, then 20, then 25, but neither Nurse Wilton nor Rick came out of the Fear Wing. Lori was in agony, waiting restlessly and trying to stay out of the way as the nurse's shifts started changing. Should she follow Rick and the nurse? She didn't want to be accused of spying, but what could those two be doing in the empty wing for so long? Finally, she couldn't stand it any longer. She made her way down the hall to the forbidden door with its yellow and black warning signs. Was anyone watching her? She didn't think so. Cautiously, she pushed open the door and entered the darkened Franklin Fear Wing. Everything was dead quiet inside, and there was a strange chill in the air. Even though the light was dim, Lori sensed that she was in a huge room that was empty. Grotesque shapes huddled on the floor, the workmen's equipment, but nothing was moving in the chaos and rubble of the new construction. "Hello?" she called fearfully. but no one answered. Where could Rick and the nurse have gone? She could see no other door. Also, the stairs connecting the floors hadn't been built yet. "Is anyone here?" she asked in a voice husky with fear. Was one of those ominous shapes on the floor something other than construction equipment? Something waiting to spring out at her? Carefully feeling her way, she stepped around the scattered mounds on the floor and made her way to the far wall. "Nurse Wilton?" Her tremulous call was greeted with silence. "Rick?" The room echoed, but only from the sound of her own voice, and that of her fear-filled breathing. Her hand touched the gritty wall at the far end of the room. She jumped at the contact. Then she started moving more quickly, her hand sliding along the wall for support. They had to be in there. But where? How big was the room? What was that lump on the floor? Just a tangle of wires. It looked awful. She hated being there. She was sorry she had come. Her thoughts were a frightened jumble as she quickened her steps. "I'm getting out of here." Just then, her foot stepped out, into empty air. She threw herself back and stood staring, horrified. There was a gaping hole in the wall. The floor, too, was sheared away, and there was nothing below it. It took her a few seconds to realize what she was staring at. The opening would undoubtedly be the elevator shaft once the Franklin Fear Wing was completed. But right then it was nothing but a hole in the floor, and she had almost stepped through it. Lori continued to back away, shocked at how close she had come to falling to her death. Her foot touched something soft. She turned and looked down. At her feet, reaching forward, was an outstretched hand. Lori jumped back, gasping in horror. A body was lying there half hidden in the construction mess. It was Nurse Wilton, her mouth open, her eyes bulging. A long surgical knife protruded from her throat. Chapter 12. Lori clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She continued to stare down at the body. There was no question that the nurse was dead. The blade of the surgical knife was completely buried in her throat. Only a few drops of red showed on her neck. The blade had sealed the wound and prevented the blood from spurting. The expression of surprise on Nurse Wilton's face would have been comical if she weren't so hideously, blankly dead. For a few seconds, Lori stood paralyzed by terror and disgust. Then she shook herself out of it and flew into action. Dodging the construction mess, she made her way to the door and out of the Fear Wing. Skye was waiting for her down the hall at the nurse's station, talking to Nurse Jenny Gerard. Frantically, Lori signaled from outside the Fear Wing door and called out, "Skye, please, come here." Nurse Gerard and Skye both stared at Lori, puzzled by the urgency in her voice. Skye ran down the hall, her eyebrows raised. Lori grabbed her arm and pulled her against the wall. "Nurse Wilton's in there, inside the Fear Wing, stabbed in the throat," Lori blurted out, the news in a frantic whisper. "She's dead." "You're kidding." Skye stared at her friend in shock. "What happened? Did you have a fight? I mean, you didn't... What are you thinking?" Lori was appalled. "I didn't do anything. I didn't touch her. She was dead when I got there. I practically fell over her." "What were you doing inside the Fear Wing?" Skye asked, her eyes moving to the yellow and black signs. "Listen, are you sure about this?" Lori nodded. "We'll have to get a doctor," Skye said. "And call the police. Call someone." Yes, right away," Lori agreed. Her legs felt like jelly as she and Skye went back to the nurse's station. "Is anything wrong?" Nurse Gerard asked as the girls ran up to the desk. "You look as if you've had a shock, Lori. What is it?" In one great outburst, Lori told her what she'd found. Nurse Gerard didn't believe her at first, any more than Skye had, but Lori kept insisting. Finally, she grabbed the phone and punched in a number. "Dr. Sherman, emergency. There's been an accident on the 9th floor, in the new Fear Wing. Sounds serious." When she hung up, she rang another number. "Security to the 9th floor. Stat. Trouble in the Franklin Fear Wing. One of the nurses may have been assaulted." Then she jumped up and beckoned Lori and Skye to follow her. "I've called the resident covering the floor tonight," she told them as they took off down the hall. "And the security guards will meet us at the new wing. You're going to have to show us where you found Nurse Wilton." Lori led the way. In her haste, she almost crashed into a gurney, with a patient under sheets being wheeled by an orderly in a surgical mask. She dodged him quickly and pushed open the door to the Fear Wing. Dr. Sherman, the young resident, arrived 2 seconds later, followed instantly by 2 security guards in blue uniforms, their guns drawn. There was a moment of confusion as everyone stopped inside the door to confront the dark room. "Don't move, anyone," the taller security guard commanded. He swept the beam from his flashlight around the rubble-strewn interior. No one was there. Nurse Gerard quickly explained what Lori had told her. "Where did you find the body?" the guard asked Lori. She pointed to the far wall, near the hole for the elevator shaft. Dr. Sherman ran forward and looked down at the floor, then back across the room at Lori. Nurse Gerard joined him, and the 2 security guards also crowded around the spot Lori had indicated. At Lori's astonishment, no one was doing anything. They weren't reacting. They weren't even examining the body. In the silence that followed, Lori crept up to the group surrounding Nurse Wilton. The floor was bare. There was no body. Chapter 13. Lori was stunned. She backed up to Skye. "She's gone," she whispered to her friend. "The body's gone." "Oh, Lori, how could you?" Skye whispered back through clenched teeth. "This isn't funny." "I wasn't joking," Lori said desperately. "She was there, with a knife in her throat." "You're in enough trouble already at the hospital without making up 6 stories," Skye said. "I know what I saw," Lori protested. The tall security guard was peering down the hole of the elevator shaft. "Nothing down there," he called to his partner. The 2 guards began sweeping the entire floor with their flashlights. Dr. Sherman and Nurse Gerard joined in the search. "Bodies don't just vanish," Skye said to Lori. "This one did. Believe me, Nurse Wilton was lying there dead not more than 10 minutes ago. Someone killed her and moved her body after I left. And I know who it was." "Who?" Skye blurted out. "Rick Spencer. I saw him follow Nurse Wilton in there." "Oh, give me a break," Skye snorted. "You're not going to tell me that Rick murdered anyone." A thoughtful look crossed Skye's face. "Listen, maybe you did see something. I don't know what to believe. But I do know we're both going to be in a lot of trouble in just a few minutes. Can't you just say it was dark and you were mistaken?" "What about the body?" "Please," Skye begged. Nurse Gerard came up to them then, her face furious. "Okay, girls, let's have it. There's no body. What's the big idea?" From behind the nurse's back, Dr. Sherman answered for them. "I'm afraid it's my fault, in a way. It's a running game of gotcha, and I got gotten," he said, chuckling. "That's it, isn't it, girls? Sorry you were pulled into it, Jenny. One of my resident buddies is into sick practical jokes. This isn't one of his best." He turned back to Lori and Skye, who were gaping at him, open-mouthed and wide-eyed. "Dr. Brooks put you up to this, didn't he?" "Oh, yes," Skye said quickly. "Dr. Brooks, that's right." "Skye!" Lori hissed at her friend. "Dr. Brooks told us what to say," Skye continued. "He said he owed you one, and you'd laugh at it." Nurse Gerard was indignant. "Well, I'm not laughing. You should all be ashamed of yourselves. I'm going to try to forget this ever happened." She stomped out of the fear wing without saying another word, trailed by the security guards who were equally annoyed. Sheepishly, Lori and Skye followed. Outside in the hall, Dr. Sherman caught up with the girls. "Do me a favor," he said in a conspiratorial voice. "Don't tell Dr. Brooks what happened. He's just mad because I put a cadaver in his locker. If I don't react, it'll drive him crazy. I won't say anything, and he'll bust a gut wanting to ask. Just pretend nothing happened. Okay?" "Fine with me," Skye said brightly. "Right, Lori?" She jabbed an elbow into Lori's side. "Sure," Lori said grimly. She watched the satisfied resident saunter away, chuckling to himself. "Do you really think Gerard believed us? Aren't they too old to be playing gotcha?" Lori muttered. "Aren't you?" Skye asked. "Listen, residents do this stuff all the time, really. I've got to run. I'm meeting Eric Porter at the mall. We're going to check out some new CDs, and then we're going to that barbecue restaurant on Canyon Drive. Want to meet us? You look as if you could use something to eat." Lori felt her face go green. Eat? After what she had seen? "No, thanks anyhow. You go ahead. I'll see you tomorrow." "You're going to hang around and wait for Nurse Wilton, is that it?" Skye asked. "Something like that." Lori wasn't going to insist on her story anymore. She was depressed that not even Skye believed her. "I'm sorry I got you into this mess." "Oh, well, what's a friend for? Let me know how you make it out." Lori walked Skye as far as the nurse's station and watched her bounce into the elevator. Nurse Gerard came out of the small back office, a light sweater over her arm, her bag slung over her shoulder. She scowled when she saw Lori, but left without saying anything. She must think I'm a jerk, Lori thought, but she didn't know how to explain any of this. Nurse Wilton was definitely murdered. But how could her body disappear from a room with only one door? And, hard as it was to believe, Rick Spencer must have done it. Killed her and, somehow, moved her body. Worse than that, Lori had the overwhelming feeling that it had something to do with little Toby Dean. Every time she had gotten close to the child, something awful had happened, something she couldn't understand. Toby, Nurse Wilton, Rick Spencer, they were all connected. She didn't know what the connection was, but she was positive that all three were involved. She knew what she had to do. Search out some answers on Fear Street, at Toby's house, and this time, she'd have to go alone. A few minutes later, as Lori was standing at the nurse's station, carts of food began rattling throughout the 9th floor corridor. Dinner time at the hospital was always very early. Soon, the nurses were busy supervising orderlies and assisting patients who needed help. Dishes clattered, and nurses ran in and out of the rooms. No one paid any attention to Lori as she slipped into the back office where the patient records were kept. She decided to check Toby's records more carefully. Maybe this time, something in them would give her a clue. Keeping her eyes and ears alert for a nurse, Lori began to search for Toby's chart. It shouldn't be too difficult this time, because she knew exactly where it would be. She found the D files and dug in. Damone, Darnell, Dayton, Debrett. Where was Dean? The files must be out of order, she thought. She checked through the entire D file, but there were no records for Toby Dean. She was getting desperate when it occurred to her that his chart might have been mistakenly returned to the folder of current patients. Creeping around the tiny office, Lori pounced on the new patient folders. Again, no luck. Nowhere in any of the records was there any sign of Toby Dean's name. It was as if he had never been in Shadyside Hospital. It was as if he had never existed at all. Chapter 14. "It's an excellent car," Skye exclaimed when Lori met her in the hospital lobby at noon the next day. Skye was drooling over the red Mercedes that was on display for the raffle. The dreamy expression in her eyes said that in her imagination she was already driving it, wearing the red outfit that was a part of her bright and shiny fantasy. "I think I'll buy a few more tickets, just to be sure." "You've got enough," Lori told her. "That's easy for you to say. If I rolled around in a fabulous white BMW like yours, I wouldn't care about the raffle either." Skye turned away from the Mercedes. "I don't think I can stand to look at it anymore. If anyone dares to win my car—" "Come on," Lori laughed. "I'm starved. Another few minutes on the 11th floor, and I would have started eating the X-rays." They headed for Patsy's Pizzeria for lunch. Neither of them could face the hospital cafeteria that day. "Well, how did it go yesterday?" Skye asked over a gooey slice of pizza with everything on it. "You're still alive. Did you catch up with Witch Wilton?" "No, I didn't. Did you see her this morning?" Skye shrugged. "Well, no. But that doesn't mean anything. She could have taken the day off. Or maybe she's working the night shift. Don't look at me like that. Just because she's not around doesn't mean that somebody killed her." "Forget it," Lori said. A day off? Working the night shift? That's what she'd heard when she asked about Nurse Wilton at the nurse's station. One nice young nurse told her that it was really hard to keep up with the schedules in the summer because all the nurses traded with one another so that they could schedule vacations. It sounded logical, but she wasn't buying it. She didn't see any point in trying to convince her friend. Skye obviously thought Lori was losing it, and Lori couldn't really blame her. She knew that Nurse Wilton was dead, but no one else was going to believe her, not without a body. And what about Toby? Why had his records disappeared? Clearly someone had removed them from the files. But why? Too many questions, Lori thought. She was gloomy all through lunch, but the afternoon in the X-ray department passed more quickly as she made plans for later that day. If she wanted answers, she'd have to head back to Fear Street, and the sooner the better. After work, Lori drove home to change her clothes. She loved clothes almost as much as Skye did, and she always dressed with care, even though she knew she'd be spending the day hidden under a drab tan hospital tunic. Now she was dressing just as carefully, but with a special purpose. Her dark jeans were shredding at the knees, not because it was the look, but because she wore them when she helped her Aunt Hillary work in the vegetable garden. Grubbing around in the dirt and grumbling about the rabbits who got to her carrots before she did was one of Hillary's favorite weekend pastimes, and Lori often joined her. With the jeans, she put on her long-sleeved dark blue t-shirt. It was light enough for summer, and it protected her arms from scratches. If her aunt had seen what Lori was wearing, she would have asked questions. So Lori was glad that Hillary hadn't come home yet when she left in her gardening clothes. It was the perfect outfit for what she had planned. Before she started her car, Lori tied a dark blue silk scarf around her head to hide her honey blonde hair. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror and thought, just what the well-dressed cat burglar should wear. Then, all whimsical thoughts vanished as she backed out of the driveway and headed for Fear Street. The shadows were already lengthening when she reached the curve in the road opposite the Fear Street Cemetery. There was a road that cut off at the edge of the woods. Lori stopped and parked well out of sight of Fear Street. The heavy, dead air of Fear Street surrounded her as she stepped out of her car. It seemed to press in on all sides, and she could almost feel her ears pop. She started to lock the car door out of habit, then stopped. She'd feel safer if she could make it back inside her car quickly, just in case. It was getting dark. A few lights started coming on in the huge houses that rose tomb-like from the deep lawns up and down the street. She shuddered as she imagined that the lights were the eyes of some unspeakable evil searching her out. Purple shadows from the trees reached for her. Lori took a few steps, but her dread was so great that she was afraid to leave the safety her car represented. Then she remembered the frightened child inside one of those dark tombs. Slowly, she crept out into the road and made it up the side of the lawn to the Dean house. Thick bushes surrounded the back of the house. Lori moved as silently as she could and hid herself behind a large bush outside the kitchen window. A light was on inside. On tiptoe, she peered inside. Little Toby Dean was sitting at the kitchen table. His face was pale. His chin dropped down on his chest, and his eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was slowly shaking his head back and forth as a strange woman sitting next to him tried to talk to him. The window was partly open, but the woman was speaking too softly for Lori to understand. The only thing she did understand was that Toby was ready to go on a trip. He was fully dressed, and a small suitcase waited in the doorway. There was no sign of the teddy bear that Lori had given him. The woman with Toby was younger than Miss Dean, and she seemed very frustrated. It was obvious that she was having no success trying to cajole the sad, unresponsive child. What could she be saying to him? And where was Toby going? There was a sudden flurry in the kitchen doorway, and a strange man entered, followed by Miss Dean. He said something to the woman at the table, and she shook her head sadly in reply. Lori saw Toby's mother take his arm and lift him to his feet. Toby tried to pull away, and burst into tears as Miss Dean led him to the back door of the kitchen. The man picked up the small suitcase, and he and the woman followed the two outside to a car parked in the driveway. Lori felt utterly helpless. Her own car was parked down the road at the edge of the woods. She'd never be able to make it there and back in time to follow Toby. Desperately, she scrabbled in her pocket for paper, pencil, anything to write the license number of the car. But it was too dark to see now. Forced to remain hidden, she watched as the woman settled Toby in his suitcase in the back of the car and joined the man up front. Miss Dean remained on the steps of the house, unmoved by Toby's tears. The car lights came on, the door slammed shut, and Lori watched as the car drove away with little Toby slumped down inside. A heavy silence followed. Lori didn't even realize that Miss Dean had gone back inside the house until she saw the woman moving through the empty kitchen. She was about to leave her hiding place and return to her car when a sudden, terrible sound rose on the still air. Lori was stunned when she recognized it. A child was shrieking, sobbing hysterically, and the dreadful sound was coming from deep inside the Dean house. Chapter 15. Lori was baffled. She slumped down in the bushes, trying to understand what had just happened. Toby had been taken away from the Dean house, probably for a long time, judging by the suitcase, and it was obvious that he hadn't wanted to go. Why had his mother sent him away, especially when he'd just gotten out of the hospital? And who were the people who'd taken him? Fear Street was quiet again. No sound came from Toby's house, but Lori couldn't forget the wild screaming she had just heard. Who was the child still inside? Was there a connection between this old house and the murder she saw at Shadyside Hospital? Or was the whole mystery a creation of her mind? She tried to review the recent events more methodically. The nightmare had started at the hospital, where the construction was going on the 9th floor, the children's floor. Shadyside Hospital, of course. That was where she had to start from, the place where it all began. And the person Lori had to talk to was the one in charge, Andy's stepfather, Dr. Raymond Price. It was his hospital, and something terrible was happening there. He would care. Lori had known Dr. Price for years, and he had always been kind to her. Even though he could be a bit overwhelming, he was friendly and pleasant whenever he saw her. He seemed to be genuinely glad that she was going out with Andy. She could talk to Dr. Price. He wouldn't think she was crazy or imagining things. He'd listen to her. He would help. She crept out of the bushes, satisfied that she was about to take a very sensible step. She would call Andy as soon as she got home and ask if she could see his father. She'd think up some excuse if Andy got too curious. She didn't want to involve him any further. When she reached the road where her car was parked, Lori pulled the silk scarf off her head. She didn't feel quite so frightened as she had when she arrived at Fear Street. Deciding to talk to Andy's father had calmed her already. Suddenly, the back of her neck began to prickle with dread. She sensed that she was being followed. She wheeled around to confront the menace. A car, a banged-up blue Honda with its headlights dim, was cruising slowly down the street. It was heading right at her. Lori dashed into the woods. Breathlessly, she slipped behind a tree and peered out. Had she been spotted? No. The car kept going past her hiding spot, slowly cruising by. It was too dark for her to see the driver. Lori really didn't want to. She just wanted to get out of there. She sprinted back through the woods to the road and dove inside the BMW, thanking her instinct for leaving the door unlocked. Her hand fumbled with the ignition key. She had to get away fast, before the sound of her engine alerted the other driver. As she twisted the key, she heard the Honda growl as it stopped, ground into reverse, and turned quickly to retrace its path back toward her. It was coming fast now, no longer cruising. Lori pumped the accelerator frantically, so frantically that she flooded the engine. The Honda stopped at the side of the road near her car. She slammed the button to lock all her doors and huddled, trembling behind the wheel. The driver of the Honda got out and began walking toward her. It was a man, and he looked familiar. Desperately, Lori tried the starter again. This time, the BMW roared to life. She lurched out toward the road, swerving to miss the man heading for her. In a flash, she saw his t-shirt, an old black Batman shirt, with the weird design that looked like an open mouth with dangling tonsils. Through a jumble of crazy, terrified thoughts, Lori was struck with the realization. It was Rick. He jumped back to avoid being hit, but tried to grab the handle of the door as Lori bounced past. "Lori, stop!" Rick called to her. She hit the accelerator hard, shot out onto the road, and took off down Fear Street in a squeal of tires. Chapter 16. Lori was still breathing hard when she turned the BMW onto the gravel driveway and parked in the large 4-car garage in back of her house. Her narrow escape from Rick had almost made her sick. All the way home, she had kept checking the rearview mirror to make sure that he wasn't following her, but there had been no sign of the blue Honda. She didn't start to relax until after she had unlocked the back door and slipped inside the house. "I'm home," she called out. Then she realized that the house was dark, upstairs and down. Aunt Hillary hadn't come home yet. Lori started turning on the downstairs lights, wishing that she could talk things over with her aunt before she did anything else. Still, she knew what she was going to do. There was no point in waiting for Hillary. She jogged up the curving staircase to her room on the second floor, filled with new energy. It wasn't too late. Maybe she could drive over to Andy's house right then and talk to Dr. Price. Time was critical if she was going to help Toby. Picking up her bedside phone, Lori punched in Andy's number. It took a while for him to answer, and he sounded excited when he did. He had just rented several horror movies, and he was watching one of them. Lori kept trying to talk, but Andy insisted on telling her the plot, about slimy invaders from Alpha Centauri with human heads and the bodies of iguanas who could survive only by eating human. "Andy," Lori pleaded, "you know I don't like that stuff. I called to ask if your father's home. I need to talk to him, and I thought if he wasn't busy, I could come over now. Is he there?" "Gee, no. He's out at a fundraising dinner. He won't be back until after midnight." "What's up?" Andy asked suspiciously. I'm doing an independent summer work project, and I need to interview your dad." Lori wasn't about to tell Andy all the gruesome events of the past few days. She couldn't take any more teasing about her supposedly wild imagination. Not from anyone, and especially not from Andy. "Why don't you come over early tomorrow morning?" Andy asked. "You can catch him before he leaves for the hospital. You want me to leave him a note?" he offered. "Would you? That'd be great." She started to say goodbye, but Andy stopped her. "Say, why not drive over here now anyhow? I'll back up the movie, and you can see where a pack of lizards catches a man and rips off his—" "Yuck!" Lori gagged. "No thanks." "Well, how about if I come over to your place?" he asked, switching to his sexiest voice. "I can think of a couple ways to entertain you, if you don't want to see a movie. Is your aunt home?" "Yes," Lori lied. "She just walked in. I'm going to have to interview her, too, for that—" a project, so I might as well get it over with tonight." After she hung up, Lori was dying for a shower, but suddenly the big house made her feel uneasy. It seemed too empty and hollow. Tiny sounds that were usually cozy and familiar began to make her skin crawl. She felt all alone and very vulnerable. Where was Aunt Hillary? How long would it be before she got home? Finally, she couldn't stand it any longer, so she called Sky. "What's up?" Sky wanted to know. "Nothing much. Are you busy?" "Actually, I was just sitting here wondering if my parents would mind if I murdered my ratty little sister. Do you know what that rotten kid did to my new leather skirt? I could kill her," Sky moaned. "Go ahead. Your mom and dad will get over it after a while. Look, if you're really not busy, could I come over? Maybe stay the night?" Lori asked. "Hey, great," Sky said. "I've got some new CDs and... Say, is something wrong?" "No, I just don't feel like staying alone tonight. Aunt Hillary isn't home, and I don't know when she'll get here. She's been working really late every night, and I'm feeling a little, well, antsy. So if you're not doing anything..." "You sure are jumpy lately," Sky said. "But sure, come on over." "I'll just write a note for Hillary," Lori said. "I'll grab a toothbrush and be there in about 10 minutes. She was about to hang up when she heard a sound downstairs. "Wait a minute, Sky. I think I hear the back door. Yes, Hillary's home. Listen, I'm going to stay, as long as she's here. Thanks anyhow for inviting me. We'll do it some other time." "You invited yourself," Sky reminded her. "But any time is fine with me. Don't forget, we're going shopping at the mall tomorrow. See you then." Lori breathed a great sigh of relief as she replaced the receiver. "Aunt Hillary? I'm upstairs," she called out. There was no answer. "I'm up here, Hillary," she called again. Silence. Panic overwhelmed her. She crept on tiptoes to her bedroom door and listened. There was a muffled creak on the back staircase. Then a few seconds of silence. Then another creak. Someone, not Aunt Hillary, was coming up the back stairs.